lifetime, I mean, I paid, I know I showed up and got 11% on a company vehicle when my buddy, same, probably worse credit than mine, doesn't make as much money as me, but he's a white dude. He walked out there with like a 6%. And I'm
Yeah.
like, how the hell? And yeah.
They destroyed a community and try to get rid of history. From Tulsa to today, welcome to End the Violence. Both you guys, welcome back. Sorry we had a week off, but I was in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and there just happened to be a Black Harley Week there to remember and honor Black Wall Street. And so I thought, what would be better? Because we're coming up, I think we're coming up on the anniversary, right? Today's in a couple days. So
Yeah, yeah.
it's,
Tulsa Massacre.
yeah, it May 21st, it was Memorial Day in May 1921. And it was horrific. And I remember learning about this in my MBA program. Got to read an article about it. I was not taught about this in high school. So to both of you, if I was to ask you, would you tell a young person today what happened in Tulsa back in 1921 and what was taken from urban communities that night, what would you both say?
I would say Dominion was taken that night. They had dominion over themselves. They built a community. They had banks. They had clothiers. They had movie theaters, hotels, and they built up their community independently and created the Black Wall Street. It was amazing what they had accomplished. And so and because of the history that's taught in schools, you'd think that Black people during those times weren't very educated. But I've read a series of books where they were writing the legal documents and different things like that. Had a lot of educated people coming out of this period, and they literally built up this city, and it was bombed. So that night, that day, and that time frame that it was attacked, I say that their dominion, the freedom to choose how they live, and the authority to choose how they live was taken away that day, among everything else that was taken.
Yeah. Yeah. It's, the way I look at it is like this, like, to me, I would say it really, really, really underscores the fear that America had, and I would say from a government perspective, of the power that African Americans had coming out of slavery. See, most people think, and feed into mass media that makes it like, hey, when you see pictures of slaves and you think of slavery, you just think of Blacks, in cotton fields, barefoot, weren't educated, weren't smart. That's just a snapshot. They don't really educate people on the significant roles that African Americans played during
Mm-hmm.
slavery. So after the Civil War, during the Reconstruction era, you got to remember Black people had all the skills. So the majority of engineers, architects, who white people weren't doing a lot of that work, especially in the South. So these slaves who were working for these landowners had the majority of skills. I mean, think
Mm-hmm.
about it, if you had a plantation, the value of what a slave could do for you wasn't just picking cotton. If you got a slave that had you know, really, really good background in
Yeah, masonry,
architecture,
carpentry,
agriculture, medicine, doctors,
animal
like, you know,
husbandry.
yeah. You know, they work if you were really a bright mind and you were a scientist, you know, yeah, of course, you know, and I'm a scientist as a white man, who would I have as an assistant? Someone that I could purchase that has all this knowledge and I can train them and I can do more. And so at the end of the Civil War, the African American communities started doing really well and doing well really, really, really at a rapid pace. You know, when you had even the cavalry, once Buffalo soldiers started coming down in the southern towns and saying, no, we're going to protect them from voting, it was almost like Jim Crow was was ushered in to balance it out for white people. Because if you were a poor southern white, what skills did you have? How many houses had you built? You know what I mean? Like, you know, so now you have these slaves and they started, you know, they were sharecroppers and they started sending their kids off to school with every penny they had to get an education. And now the kids came back with a formal education built with all of the skills that they already had. So, you know, Tulsa is a community that just clearly represents that. And there were a lot of communities like that across America. So how were you going to balance it out? You went from slavery, we're thinking that white culture is the dominant culture. Now, during Reconstruction, how do you explain to your kids and everything if all these blacks start outperforming and their communities are better?
I
I
never
mean,
really,
Tulsa,
I
they had a
never thought
black
of it that way.
airline,
I never thought
right?
about you. The African American community had all the skills because the white plantation owner was the lazy guy walking around with the whip and his, you know, mint juleps, right? That's the way I kind of look at it now. You totally
Well,
changed my way of thinking on that. And it makes total sense because, you know, talking to, while I was there in Tulsa and talking to people involved, first off, I got to say, some of the nicest Harleys I've seen in my life were there. Um, but also just how proud they were, and you could see that everyone that was there, how successful they were. So, what would you consider is the Black Wall Street today?
I- I'm wondering if we could back it up a little bit though, Gershon, to
Sure.
something that you just said. You know that the white slave owners would have been sitting there sipping on their mint juleps, you know, their lavender lemonades. Is, you know, kind of more far from when we think about it. They had to maintain control over these resourceful individuals. And there was a whole psychology that had to be constantly played and kept in place in order to continue that. So I think that, you know, they came across from the continent, Mali, Ghana, other places like that, with like we said earlier, animal husbandry, the tides and the seasons and the moons in order to know when. So I call it mental technology. They came across a certain mental technology, masonry, right? The numbers. You know, when we look at the Moors and the designs and the shapes and all this kind of stuff like that, they knew all this stuff. They came into mathematics and all these sorts of things, right? So I think that, you know, to recognize that, I'm gonna give, this is gonna sound crazy. I'm gonna give the folks that the enslavers some credit for recognizing that. And then I'm like, man, they really went in though when they managed all of that for however long it lasted, and you know, took advantage of those skills. And then once we were freed, we began to deploy those skills across the nation. And I think I mentioned to you in a private conversation that over 3,000, that's the number I'll give, over 3,000 of such cities like Tulsa were destroyed or bought through eminent domain as well. And I'm sure we can go deeper into that.
Yeah. If you another, like, to underscore your point, um, if you go to Savannah, Georgia, and look at around like the coastal area, the docks and things, and you look at the architecture, how the stones were laid, and how all those were, and we're talking, you know, we're going back into what, like maybe even like the 16, 1700s. And that architecture, you know, it looks very, very similar to the architecture you would see like in Cartagena in Colombia, and the Great Wall that when Spain occupied that part of Colombia, and a lot of people think, oh, okay, well these were white people, but they weren't. They were Moors. They were African architects, and so the same carried through all the way through the history of our country. It's not like blacks were. Most of the architecture, the mathematics, the science, and all of that originated there. These people were migrating from Egypt, from northern Africa and these areas into. The Moors were the ones who developed the European, most of the architecture and most of the societies in Europe, but people don't give credit to that, and that's unfortunate. We don't really get accurate history in the world, so we just try to fill the narrative in with blanks or snapshot pictures or visions that we've seen in history books. But you're absolutely right. Even on those plantations and things like that, I mean, blacks were extremely talented, and after the war, they were extremely talented, and that's what Tulsa points to. You think of the Civil War ending, and Tulsa was so advanced. Again, they had an airline. These are the foundation of our country. In the early years of our country, there were significant contributions from African Americans, but that history was robbed for us. And I think the unfortunate part today is we believe a false narrative about ourselves. African Americans believe a false narrative about ourselves. So when we look at cities and things like, I'd say probably a larger percentage of African Americans now don't know much about those cultures and societies. I mean, I think they probably have just as much of a skewed, view of our contributions and who we are as a people.
And I would add this in. You asked the question, what's the modern Black Wall Street? And I'm going to just boldly say there is none. I don't care how many paid athletes, paid actors, paid business people, whatever. I don't think there's a Black Wall Street today. Why? Because the advantage, the meritocracy that was, this claim of merit based has not been true. And so I think at this stage of how we're moving into a technological world, Black people have always had to do it 10 toes down the hard way, right? Mm-hmm. Always paid higher interest, even with better credit. I mean, on your house, your car, your whatever, right? Your credit card, because your skin color determined the risk level. So I think we've always had to do the daggone thing really well. And where we are now is that the opportunity to have built the Wall Street, the Black Wall Street, that embarrassment of wealth that could transition us into a good position for this next iteration after the great reset of our world. I think that we've missed that opportunity. So now it's time for us to get wise in the world that we're moving into and benefit. But the Black Wall Street doesn't exist currently like it did then. No.
I'd agree. I mean, I think America learned its lesson too after Black Wall Street, and I feel like the Jim Crow era did a lot to really hurt Black people, but I feel like it was targeted to hold Black people back, and we continually bounce back. I think that the latest impact of history. Or the latest detriment in our history came when, we started looking at policies, or from a government standpoint, the government started looking at policies that would break up the Black family. Lyndon B. Johnson era, and the movement to, hey, we're going to bring in all these social services and welfares, and as long as the Black family was strong, the people were strong. And if I had to look at any city that I would see evidence of Blacks having unity and togetherness and power, and it's not perfect, but the closest I would say would be like Atlanta. I mean, you have so much Black wealth in Atlanta. It'd be hard for a Black person that lives in Atlanta to say, hey, I can't get a fair shake from a business perspective or, investment perspective or things like that. I think that's probably, and that's not a great example. I mean, Tulsa was, a really, really high mark at an early period in our history that should have been modeled. But can you imagine if it would have been modeled? Imagine if Tulsa would have been able to grow, and all those cities across the U.S. were able to keep their resources.
I mean, there has to be some level of banking for Wall Street to exist, right? So I think that there are, like you mentioned, Georgia and Killer Mike and some other individuals have joined together to form a bank during COVID. I don't know how well that bank is doing, but then there are several other Black-owned banks, and there were many more in the past. But again, systematically, those have, been shut down for one reason or the other. So I think, in order to have that Wall Street, we gotta be banking for this next
Yeah,
iteration.
you're right. My best friend is a county commissioner here in Central Ohio. His name is Kevin Boyce, but he has a Black bank. It's the only full service Black bank in the state of Ohio. It's called Adelphi. And his story is amazing. I won't go into that, but how the bank was developed and why he developed, and created that bank is a great story. But you're right, it comes down to resources. But I think collectively it comes down to intellect. Like, there's a lot of division in our community that I feel like was targeted at us. And so when we don't work together, it's hard for us to advance. And so, I feel like over my lifetime, there has been more people who were motivated to assimilate with the dominant culture. So I feel like you have more people who say, hey, I'm gonna go to school, I'm gonna get educated, and I'm gonna move to a good neighborhood, which means that they were implying that their neighborhood was bad. So the resources didn't come back to those communities where there were primarily, African American. The resources were going to the suburbs or to where the wealth was. And that was, our high mark. Now look where I live. I don't live in the hood anymore. And that came through wanting to assimilate, because if we would take all of that talent and brought it back to these same communities, they would look totally different.
Let me play the devil's advocate, and unless you want to cut in there, Gershon, with a question or something.
Play devil's advocate.
So my wife is from Harlem, and so exactly what you described, you and I both know where that leads, right? So once they leave the brain drain, right,
Mm-hmm.
they go off and they move to the suburban house, or they leave to another state or whatever. Those inner cities become blight for a minute. Housing prices drops, abandoned houses like Baltimore, et cetera, et cetera. It's bought up by developers, and next thing you know,
They're all moving back in.
ching, ching, ching. Not the folks that left,
Yeah, not the folks
but
that left.
yeah,
all the people
but
who
a
didn't want
lot
nothing to
of
do with it.
another demographic moves in. We call it, there's a name for it that everybody agrees on. It's called gentrification.
Yep.
So I mean, is that a ploy? Is that a strategy, or is that just what happens when our people leave and don't come back?
Yeah,
I've seen, like, there's a mayor in there's a political leader in a couple of cities that I pastored in. They would come back and build these nice houses, but my goodness, the fences and the security was like,
yeah,
they were in Fort Knox.
So you look at how racism led to a massacre in 1921. So am I right by hearing to what you both just said? You think racism is just, even though it's evolved, it's still as destructive?
I think segregate. Well, go ahead. Go ahead. You sound like you answer more direct than me.
Who, me?
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
I think it's racism now it can hide itself in many of forms, but the damage has been done. Like people say, well, there's no more racism and this and that, but what we do know is historically the government targeted racist practices towards Black people. And I think that's where the whole argument around, at least for me, around reparations gets lost, because a lot of people get into reparations and they say, well, I didn't do this, so why should the white people now have to pay? And it's like, I don't think the argument is that white people have to pay. I think the argument is the government has to pay. Whenever the government has targeted or unfair practice or racism, anything toward a people, the only way to deal with it is they have to admit it, and then they have to pay some type of reparations. I mean, isn't that what happened in that's what happened to Germany for what they did? Like, it's like, you're not going to run from this. You're not going to escape what you did. We're going to make sure that and we're going to make sure that everyone knows in history that this happened.
Yeah.
And you're going to pay a price for that. And I think that conversation, those things never happened for African Americans. And so over the history of our world, so much of our contributions and the facts about the world and how we developed have been hidden or lost or covered up, whether it was intentional or not intentional. It's the damage was done to us more in a more targeted effort. There's a lot of psychology around it that people don't talk about. We do know that on plantations during slavery, that they would release slaves every once, and they would give them their freedom. And people are like, well, if they're so bad, why would they give them their freedom? Well, there was a psychological kind of a practice that was going on where we would take a slave, they would take a slave, and they had that slave tell on all the other slaves and report and be really, really, really good to the master, and then the master would free him. And a lot of I've read where people say, well, that's why we're not unified, because they would make us turn on each other. But I think there was a bigger thing that happened during slavery with that practice, and that was psychologically, you were almost conditioning Black, people to believe that they couldn't be successful collectively, because I'm freeing one slave. This slave is off free because he did my work and he sided with me, and now he's living the good life. But where do we see that as a culture where we're raising up as a group, where we're unified collectively, supporting our own businesses, our own stores, and the things that they did in Tulsa? And so when after slavery in Tulsa didn't work and you ushered in Jim Crow, Black people were still comfortable, like, hey, we'll still build our communities and do these type of things. But the real impact was getting us to not unify. And we still see those practices today. I've talked about it with ETV. It's like when law enforcement goes into Black communities and employs hundreds and hundreds of informants to tell on other Black people. And they're like, well, that's keeping crime down. And I'm like, okay, but it's also ripping our communities apart. The biggest thing that we face as a people is a unity issue. And if you turn, I don't care if it's criminals, I don't care what you're talking about, if we turn us all against each other, how is that going to help us as a people get out of these situations? So in a larger, perspective of that whole practice, you're hurting the community. You're doing more harm to the community than you think you're doing good.
I mean, and the answer I would give to that is, integration was probably the worst thing for us. We were doing fine in our communities, raising our children, disciplining, educating, and a lot of these things. We were contributing, and I'm using America as an example because I could go into the Caribbean and elsewhere, but we were raising our children, and it was two-parent homes, all of these sorts of things coming through. I don't even have to go back that far. We can go back into the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and we were still doing these things. But integration, which is, way down the road from I think Tulsa happened. What year did Tulsa happen actually, in particular? Do you recall that?
The massacre?
The massacre, yeah. It was like,
1921.
yeah, so that precedes, the era that I'm referring to in particular with integration. But I mean, leading up to that, I think if the thing I would say most blatantly is that uh, for the majority who ran and run this country, if they would have taken their foot off of the necks of those individuals and not interfere with what they were actually accomplishing, we would see a different America today. And I don't think we'd be able to demonize Black boys and girls and people of color. Slavery has changed in so many ways. I mean, my grandfather came here as a migrant fruit worker, fruit picker, and sugarcane. He said he did sugarcane for a week, and he said, I can't do it no more. But he would come seasonally and pick fruit. And then that changed, that he was Bahamian. That changed to the Mexicans and other people from South and Central America coming across to do that menial labor that nobody wanted to do, not even Black folk wanted to do anymore. And so, we've come through so many shifts. This world has always had to hold somebody inferior so they could be viewed as exploitable. And so, if you allow them to build up, they see that, and now they got the prototype. Oh, I can do that too. So that's why I love to develop products and because I like to inspire, especially children. I've watched children say, "You made that?" Like when I made an animated series for kids, they're like, "You did that?" And I was like, "Yeah, I hired some animators. I didn't do it myself." But they're like, "Wow!" They're looking at you like you're a superhero, and you can see their wheels turning. Well, if he could do that, what can I do? And I think that again, we didn't get to build that crazy wealth that so many others were allowed to build in their properties and all sorts of things, because properties, eminent domain, that's a whole section we could go into, was utilized out there in California. I think a family just got back some prime property that was taken from them in eminent domain or some other practice, some other nefarious practice that is pushed as legitimate. So, you know,
Yeah,
I
higher
think,
interest
yeah.
rates.
Go ahead.
No, I was gonna say higher interest rates when you talk about property, and we got to remember that historically in America, America gave millions of acres of land to immigrants, just not us.
And
You know what I mean?
started community colleges to train
Right.
them on how to take advantage of these things, of the land.
Yeah, yeah, right. Land grant schools. They built land grant schools, and hey, let's teach them how, agricultural skills, and I mean,
Mhm.
and even to this day, landholder. We look at farmers and we look at subsidies that go to the farmers and everything, and we say we still support that. But during that period of history, we didn't get a part of that. And so if you look at that and you look at merely after the Civil War, we started really doing well, across the states. And now there was, there was this tidal wave of racism that came in, and it wasn't because we were doing it in our own communities. It was because our communities were so much better.
And we were trading with other communities of other ethnic groups and races, et cetera. But I think at the end of the day, what we're getting at with talking about Tulsa and the anniversary coming up and et cetera, is that, when left to our own devices, we have thrived. We took the L and we have thrived
Right.
and could coexist. And you mentioned reparations earlier, Atiba. I mean, again, everybody else has gotten reparations for the wrongs that were done to them. When the wrongs that were done to people of color are discussed along with reparations, it's vehemently thrown to the side. And so, I'm not sitting around waiting for reparations. Gershon knows I'm building an empire as fast as I can. But at the end of the day, if
Okay. Can I
yeah.
jump in on reparations really quick? Because I'm coming
Mhm.
from the California perspective. And I don't want to talk about reparations, but you both have brought it up. What I don't understand is, why does California believe they that we need reparations out here in a state where slavery never existed, was never legal? Why does this state need reparations?
I don't know the history of California apparently to be able to speak to that.
Yeah, I'm with you on that, but from my perspective, my limited knowledge, it's always seemed like a political move out there. I'm not a person who goes around who says, we need reparations, but as a Black man, I can't argue against reparations. And I think the problem is when we talk about reparations.
Why can't you argue against reparations?
Because it's not to me, because it's a matter of looking at it very objectively. You know what I mean? Like, I've never felt inferior to white people. I don't feel like I can't compete with white. I'm telling you on a personal level, I don't feel like I have a problem. I mean, I grew up in the hood. I grew up fucking dirt poor, but I'm doing fine. My kids are doing fine. That wasn't my reality. I didn't let, and I'm a guy that you got locked up and made a lot of mistakes. And so I also am very confident in me and what I can do. So personally, I'm not out here going, yeah, if it wasn't for, I don't feel like that, but I feel like I'm not going to argue against it, because it doesn't have to do with that. It has to do with, did the United States of America target this group of people and do injustices to them? And that becomes a racial divide in America, because for some reason, when you talk about reparations in America, white people think that we're talking to them. We're talking to the government. You know what I mean? White people say, well, why do you want me to pay for it? No, whenever the fucking US fucks up, they go pay for it.
They pay for it all over the world.
All over the world. Then they do it for Japanese.
And the slave owners received reparations immediately after slavery.
Yeah.
Immediately after slavery, and companies over in England and on the continent of Europe, et cetera, they have had, they're considering, those companies like Lloyd's of London and companies like that have received reparations immediately after slavery, and those reparations today are worth billions and billions and billions of dollars. So
and we talking, and here's the other thing. If I could just add this to what you're saying, Pastor. Here's the piece that people seem to forget when we have this discussion. We're not talking about just what was done in slavery. We're just talking about Tulsa, and the only city the U.S. has ever bombed was fucking our city. It was us.
And it's not the only one that was bombed. There's
exactly.
over 3,000 in Central Park. There's a city buried there. There was a black city in Central Park located on that land, and that city was flooded and built over.
Yeah,
that's just one, again, out of over 3,000. So I mean,
you could go far beyond that. You could go to redlining. You could go to so many government practices that were allowed, that the government, I'm not even just talking about the privates, the government was actually involved in against Black people. So when you say that, then it's not a Black-white issue. It's a humanity type of issue. But white people feel personal when you talk about reparations, that Black people are saying, you need to go in your pockets and dig out some money and give it to me. And they may say, well, it's the government money and the government money in this. Well, how do you explain all the money the government just spent on immigrants?
I mean, there is the sad reality that also, and I might get some dings for saying this, that a lot of times also, if we were to get $5 million each, or so, that's just a random number, right? Because it probably pay out in other ways. There'll probably be sovereign.
That's the number they threw around in California.
Okay, they said 5. So let's say 5 million. A lot of that's going to go right at this stage right now. A lot of that's going to go right back into the coffers of some European-owned company anyway. Some car brands, some clothing brands, some whatever, trying to live in some particular neighborhood or whatever. Sadly, I think we need an elevation beyond all of that. That's why I show up for these podcasts, because I'm like, the conversation has to be elevated to how do we break out of this. We've got to talk about the passes for reference, not for residents. So any reference to the past for me is just, so let's say this is the reality of what happened. This is the ugliness. But how do we go forward from here? I think government contracts, even though Trump says merit-based, and
Yeah.
and I happen to believe that even though there probably be some pork bellies passed out, that it's going data-driven, so it will actually at the end of the day being a form of merit-based, because you just have to have your stuff together, and you can prosper in this next iteration.
So going off of what you guys are saying, what would you want young Black children to know? Not what happened in Tulsa, but where it's led your community to today, if that question makes sense. Like, what should they take out of Tulsa? What is the important parts that you would want them to know?
Self-determination is a powerful tool. And, some of these people were war veterans coming back with a variety of skills. These were people, who, like you said, were sent to HBCUs and got their educations. And I'm going to say that, not everybody has to go off to college. You can go to technical school and et cetera. But I'm going to say become a repairer of the breach. That's what I'm going to say to the next generation. Make up your mind that you're going to join those who are a repairer of the breach, a rebuilder, a builder for the generations to come, and gain some skills that will build the community, not destroy, not just leave the community or otherwise. We're entering a new day, and I would say, wisen up. Mm-hmm. Be willing to be placed under good authority so you can become the authority in the room.
Apply now for your DBA at Pepperdine.
This guy. I'm just going to sip on my juice, man.
So how about everyday people? How do we make sure that we don't forget what happened in Tulsa in 1921?
Well, this is what I would say. Like, Tulsa's just a small part of history. And I think what my message would be to our people is, let's go uncover all of the history. Pastor Andre said it earlier, like, we got to go back to the history and the real development of the United States of America. And prior to what we know as the history of America, because there's a lot of lies and a lot of misinformation that's been given about the Americas, both continents for that matter, and the role that Black people, Africans, played in these continents. And I think when we uncover that and we start to look at some of those truths, I mean, this is probably going to stir a lot of pots, man, but I'm going to just go ahead and say it. Like, I don't even believe that Black people should be talking about reparations. I think Black people should be talking about the true ownership of the United States. And I think Black people should be talking about whose ancestors actually developed, a lot of history, a lot of the things out here. I mean, maybe the conversation shouldn't be, we were brought over here as slaves and everything. Maybe the conversation should be, who was really here first? So is it reparations we're owed, or is it rent we're owed? I mean, it's a different conversation if you ask me. So this is like opening Pandora's box if you start talking about that, because I'm a person that's going to say, put the fucking truth on the table. Let's open up, hell, all of the history. Let's see what it is, and let's talk about it, and let's learn it, and let's go through it so that we're having an accurate conversation. Because the problem is, I feel like being an African American is, when we have these conversations, everybody looks and thinks that Black people are just standing around with our hands out. And when they look at our unfortunate situations today, they point the finger at us and say, hey, you're the problem, but don't take responsibility for the bigger narrative. We talk about the violence in these communities, but nobody wants to talk about the factors the variables that stem from our treatment and targeted practices to us that put us in these situations. Even to this day, we're being exploited. You go into these communities and there's a lie being told. The lie is that everybody that lives in the hood is a criminal or is dangerous or is this and that. And there's a reason, again, because we're the low-hanging fruit. Somebody's going to be exploited in America, and it's Black people. So if you move us out of that exploitation and Black people start to collectively build their communities, we start to build our communities and we start to advocate for ourselves, well, that's going to happen at the expense of other people, primarily other white people. And it's not a racial thing, but again, I talk about the amount of money that in the state of Ohio that 80 counties are making off of 8 urban counties. We got to talk about, why law enforcement is such a big department in the United States, why prisons are so big and why they're so populated. And, did slavery really end, or did we just move it to the prison systems? And Tulsa, it brings up a lot of recent, you talk about the 1920s and people don't know the success of Black people during that time. That's just the tip of the iceberg. So if you keep digging, you're going to get more of the narrative out there. And I think collectively, I think if that history comes out, I do think all people will feel differently about it. I think white people will feel differently about it if the true story emerges.
I would love for that to be the outcome as well, that everybody becomes more educated. But like Gershon, when did you learn about Tulsa?
My MBA
The
program.
massacre.
My MBA
Okay,
program.
so a few years ago, right?
Yep.
I learned about Tulsa 1995, 96 because of a classmate in my when I was in the seminary up in Michigan. I would have never heard about it because it wasn't a part of even my upbringing, and so I think that now with social media and it being so evident, the pushback was enormous. The pushback became, the governors and the president and everybody involved saying, get this stuff out of the schools because the information was flooding in, that these are the sorts of things, these are the realities, and these are the truths. And so I don't think that people really want the truth. Do they really want the facts? And again, even in this information age, they're leaking out slowly but surely. So it's what it is.
Well, with that, basically what I just want to tell everyone watching, listening, is that we all need to make sure we educate ourselves. So things like Tulsa don't hurt again. Maybe we do need to change the narrative. But the most important thing is we need to have these crucial conversations and sit down at the table. Keep voice your opinion, but keep your emotions under control, like we're trying to do here. So Atiba, Andre, it was great talking to you guys. I hope you have a great Memorial Day.
You too.
Thank you again
for
teaching me more about Tulsa. And like I said, I've always wanted to be educated. So I can't thank you guys enough. We will all talk to you next time here at End the Violence. Thank you for listening.